The bed was still warm where she had been lying. Isolde stood in the doorway of the royal chambers, her hand resting on the cold iron latch, and she looked back one last time. Not at him, at the room itself, at the massive canopied bed with its tangled furs and heavy velvet drapes, at the hearth where the fire had burned down to sullen crimson embers, at the carved stone walls that had witnessed every whispered secret, every tender silence, every night she had fallen asleep believing she was loved. Ravek stood on the other side of the room, his chest heaving, his golden eyes blazing with a fury that had nowhere to land. He was the Alpha King. He had commanded armies. He had broken rebellions with his bare hands. And he was standing in his own bedroom, watching his mate gather a blanket and a nightgown as if she were a guest checking out of an inn. "I forbid it," he said. His voice shook the timbers. Isolde turned to face him. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She looked at the most powerful wolf in the kingdom and spoke a single word. "No." Then she walked out. And the silence she left behind was the loudest sound Ravik had ever heard 6 weeks earlier. The kitchens of Heartwood Citadel were a world unto themselves. Buried deep in the eastern wing, they were a maze of stone ovens, iron hooks, and long wooden tables scarred by decades of cleavers and rolling pins. The air was perpetually thick with the scent of rising bread, simmering bone broth, and dried herbs hanging in bundles from the low ceiling. It was the warmest place in the citadel, even warmer than the Great Hall, and Isolde loved it. She moved through the controlled chaos with practiced ease, her fingers trailing along the edge of a shelf lined with clay jars of preserved fruit. She was counting: plum, blackberry, apple. She pulled a leather journal from the pocket of her woolen dress and made a small notation. The winter stores were ahead of schedule, but barely. If the first frost came early, they would need to supplement with grain from the Iron Ridge trade route. She made another note. Speak to the trade master. She was not beautiful in the way the court expected a queen to be beautiful. She did not have the sharp porcelain features of high-born she-wolves or the voluptuous curves that drew hungry stares in the Great Hall. Isolde was small, fine-boned, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders in waves she rarely bothered to tame, and eyes the color of a forest floor after a long rain, deep brown, flecked with green, quiet and watchful. Her beauty was the kind that revealed itself slowly, in the way candlelight finds the hidden facets of an uncut stone. She had been an Omega from the Grey Mist Pack, a minor territory so small it barely registered on the kingdom's maps. The daughter of a tanner and a seamstress. No bloodline, no fortune, no wolf of any remarkable power. When the Alpha King had chosen her as his mate 3 years ago, the court had treated it as a scandal. When he had marked her, they had treated it as a temporary madness. When she had, month after month, failed to produce an heir, they had treated it as confirmation of everything they had always believed. She was not enough. Isolde had spent 3 years proving them wrong. She had learned the language of diplomacy, the mathematics of supply chains, the delicate art of managing a court full of wolves who smiled to her face and whispered behind her back. She had earned the grudging respect of the pack elders, the quiet loyalty of the household staff, and the genuine affection of the common wolves who saw in their queen a reflection of their own struggles. But earning respect and receiving love were two very different things. A crash from the far corner of the kitchen snapped her attention. She looked up to see Brielle, a young Omega girl of perhaps 16, on her knees on the stone floor. A tray of copper goblets lay scattered around her, wine pooling in dark rivers between the flagstones. Standing over her was Gareth, One of the senior beta guards, his face twisted with irritation. His hand connected with the side of her head before Isolde could even open her mouth. The sound was sharp, ugly, a crack of flesh against flesh that silenced every conversation in the kitchen. Brielle crumpled, her small body curling inward, her hands flying up to cover her face. She did not cry out. Omegas learned early not to cry out. Isolde was across the kitchen in seconds. She did not run. She did not shout. She simply appeared the way a shadow appears when a cloud moves away from the sun. Gareth. Her voice was quiet. That was the thing about Isolde. The quieter she became, the more dangerous she was, but so few people had learned to read that signal. The beta turned, and to his credit, a flicker of something that might have been shame crossed his heavy features. My queen, the girl is clumsy. She has ruined a full service of wine meant for the evening feast, and I was merely correcting. Isolde knelt beside Brielle. She did not look at Gareth. She looked at the girl, at the red mark blooming across her cheekbone, at the terror in her wide gray eyes. Isolde reached out and gently, so gently, moved a strand of hair away from the girl's face. Are you hurt? She asked softly. Brielle's lower lip trembled. I'm sorry, my queen. I tripped. I am so sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. Isolde stood, and now she looked at Gareth. Her gaze was level, calm, and utterly without warmth. This girl serves the queen's household. If there is a problem with her performance, you bring it to me. You do not strike a member of my staff. Not today. Not ever. Is that understood? Gareth's jaw tightened. For a moment, the air between them crackled with something volatile. He was a beta. She was an omega. In the raw hierarchy of wolves, he outranked her in everything except the mark on her neck and the title it carried. But Isolde did not look away. She held his gaze the way a woman holds a blade, with steady, deliberate purpose. Understood, my queen, he muttered, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. Isolde helped Brielle to her feet, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. Go to the healers. Have Marin look at that bruise. And Brielle? The girl looked up, her eyes still glassy with unshed tears. You are not clumsy. Trays are heavy. It happens to everyone. The girl nodded, a fragile, grateful thing, and hurried away. Isolde stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by spilled wine and scattered goblets, and for a moment she let herself feel the weight of it, the exhaustion, the constant vigilance, the quiet, grinding work of being a queen in a kingdom that had never quite decided whether she deserved the title. She picked up the goblets herself, one by one, placing them back on the tray with careful hands. No servant rushed to help her. They watched, and in their watching, they loved her a little more. Later that afternoon, Isolde walked the long corridor that connected the east wing to the royal apartments. The hallway was lined with portraits of former queens, their painted eyes following her progress with expressions of imperial disapproval. At the very end, before the corridor turned toward the king's chambers, there was a door. It was heavier than the others, made of dark ironwood, and it had been shut for nearly 4 years. Since the passing of Ravek's mother, the formidable Dowager Queen Helene, no one had entered the chambers beyond. Ravek had ordered it sealed, not out of sentimentality, but out of a grief he refused to name. Isolde paused before it. She pressed her palm flat against the wood and closed her eyes. Through the grain, through the years of silence, she caught the faintest whisper of a scent. Dried roses, old parchment, the ghost of a woman who had ruled this kingdom with an iron spine and a soft heart. She did not know why she stopped here so often. She only knew that something about this closed door called to her, a quiet recognition, as if the room beyond were waiting. She pulled her hand away and continued walking. In their bedroom, she opened the top drawer of the armoire. Beneath a folded shawl of gray wool lay a pair of tiny leather shoes. She had stitched them herself during the first year of their mating, when hope had been as natural as breathing. Soft calf skin, barely the length of her thumb, with delicate embroidery along the sole. Tiny wolves chasing each other in an endless circle. She touched them with the tip of one finger. Then she closed the drawer. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about this a long time ago. That evening, the great hall of Heartwood Citadel was a cavern of noise and heat, thick with the scent of roasted game, spiced wine, and the overlapping territories of 100 powerful wolves. Flames from the twin hearths danced across heavy tapestries depicting the triumphs of the Hart lineage, casting long, predatory shadows that writhed across the stone floor. Isolde entered the hall expecting the usual choreography of a formal feast. The nod to the elders, the murmured greetings, the walk to the high table where she would take her seat beside Ravik and perform the role of queen for another evening. But tonight, the choreography had changed. She saw the woman first. Then she understood. Serena sat in Isolde's chair. She was a beta from the Iron Ridge pack, with eyes the color of whiskey and a laugh that carried too easily across the cavernous space. Her hand rested on Ravik's forearm, a casual, proprietary gesture that silenced conversations in ripples moving outward from the high table. Every wolf in the hall felt the wrongness of it. They saw their king permit the touch, his face a mask of bored indifference, and they turned their eyes to the woman he was trying to break. Isolde had been placed 2 seats down, a deliberate, calculated distance, not banished, not sent away, shifted, demoted in a way that was both subtle and brutally public. Everyone was watching her, waiting for the explosion. They expected the queen to rise, to scream, to throw a goblet of wine and stake her claim with the ferocity her station demanded. Her wolf, they assumed, must be clawing at the inside of her skin, desperate to lash out. Instead, Isolde sat down. She picked up her fork. She sliced a piece of venison with precise, unhurried movements. She brought it to her lips and chewed, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the tapestry opposite, the one showing Ravik's grandfather felling a great bull elk. Her posture was perfect. Her expression was serene. When a nervous attendant came to refill her water, she looked up and offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, John." The attendant nearly dropped the pitcher, and through the bond, that invisible tether that connected her soul to Ravik's, she sent nothing. Not rage, not anguish, not even contempt. She simply closed the door and drew the curtains and left him standing outside in the cold. Ravik felt the absence like a sudden drop in temperature. He had been probing that bond for weeks, sending barbs of jealousy, anger, and deliberate neglect down its length, waiting for her to send a storm back. All he received was silence, a smooth, placid surface where a raging ocean should have been. He had designed this evening to be the final, crushing blow. He wanted to see her composure crack, to see the pain that would prove he still owned her heart. He wanted her to fight for him, to remind the entire court that she was his and his alone. He needed to see the fire that had first drawn him to her, the spirit that had challenged him and made him feel like more than just a crown and a title. He glanced at her, expecting to find a tremor in her hand, a flicker of anguish in her eyes. He saw nothing. She was listening to old Lord Edric, her head tilted with polite interest as the elder wolf spoke about some forgotten border dispute. She was not watching Ravik. She was not pretending not to watch him. She had simply turned her attention elsewhere. Serena laughed again, leaning closer to whisper something in his ear. But Ravek barely heard her. The meat in his mouth had turned to ash. A cold dread, foreign and sharp, began to crawl up his spine. This quiet, unreachable calm was not the reaction of a woman scorned. It was the reaction of a woman who was finished. And in that moment, something small and terrified inside the Alpha King began to understand what he had done. But understanding and admitting were two very different things. He found her in the royal library after the feast. The room was dark, save for a single lamp that cast a warm, golden pool of light on the desk where she sat. She was reading, a heavy, leather-bound tome open before her. She did not look up when he entered, though the scent of him, mingled now with Serena's cloying perfume of nightshade and musk, announced his presence like a warning. "You were quiet tonight," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was an accusation. She turned a page. Was there something that required a comment? Her voice was soft, melodic, and utterly devoid of heat. It was the voice she used with visiting emissaries and nervous courtiers. Polite, distant, empty. "You know what? Serena at my side. She seemed to enjoy the honor," Isolde replied, her eyes still on the page. "Her pack will be pleased." He stalked closer, planting his hands on the desk and leaning over her, forcing her to look up. He flooded the bond with his presence, with his dominance, with the raw, possessive anger he had been cultivating all night. "Look at me. Feel this. React." She met his gaze. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor after the rain, were clear. There was no pain in them, no anger, not even sorrow. There was just a deep, unnerving stillness. She did not flinch from his display of power. She did not bow her head in submission. She simply absorbed it, as a stone absorbs the heat of the sun, and remained unchanged. "Ravek," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "What is it you want from me?" The question stunned him into silence. She stood, and her voice was quiet but absolute. "I have sat at your table. I have upheld the dignity of your court by refusing to cause a scene. I have managed your household and met with the pack elders. I am doing everything your mate is required to do." "That is not what I mean," he growled. "Then what do you mean?" she asked. "Do you want me to rage? To weep for the benefit of your audience?" She paused, her gaze holding his. "You have made your choices, Ravek. You have placed another in my seat. You have carried her scent into our home. My fighting you will not change that. It will only give the court a spectacle and weaken your position as king." She closed the book. The soft thud echoed in the silent room. "I will not weaken this kingdom, not even for you." She walked past him. Her shoulder brushed his arm. He expected a jolt, a spark from the bond, some recognition of their proximity. There was nothing. It was like brushing against a stranger. And her scent, rain-soaked earth and chamomile and clean linen, was already fading, being swallowed by the heavier perfume that clung to his own skin. In their bedroom, the confrontation he had been craving finally arrived, but it wore a face he did not recognize. He backed her against the armoire, caging her in with his arms, flooding the bond with every ounce of his dominance. He was the Alpha King. His presence alone had sent armies into retreat. "You are mine." Her heartbeat did not quicken. She looked up at him, and in her dark eyes he saw not defiance, but resignation. A weariness so deep it had settled into her bones. "This will not work anymore, Ravek," she whispered. "Your anger does not frighten me. Your power is for the kingdom. It is not a tool to mend what you have deliberately broken between us." She moved around him and gathered her things. A nightgown, a silver-backed brush, a small book of poetry. She folded them into a woolen blanket. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I will be sleeping in the Dowager Queen's chambers tonight. They have been empty since your mother's passing." "They are quiet. You will not. You will stay here, in this room, in our bed." She turned slowly, the bundle held in her arms. "No." "I forbid it!" he roared, the sound shaking the room. And Isolde looked at him with those calm, devastating eyes and said, "How will you enforce that command, Your Majesty? Will you have your guards drag me to a bed that carries the scent of another woman? Think of how that story will be told in the halls tomorrow. The mighty king, so insecure he must lock his own mate in her room because he fears she will leave him." Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow, striking not at his heart, but at his crown. She was using his own power, his own position, against him. She had checkmated him without raising her voice. In a final act of desperation, he flung open the door and barked at the guard captain. "Find the beta from Iron Ridge. Serena, see her to the gates immediately. Her visit is concluded." He turned back to Isolde, his chest heaving. "There. I have fixed it. Now stay." And for the first time all night, something crossed her face. It was the most devastating expression he had ever seen on another living soul. Pity. "That was for the benefit of the guard, Ravek. For your reputation, not for me." She walked past him, out the open door, and down the corridor toward the Dowager's wing. She did not look back. Ravek stood frozen in the doorway. He listened to her soft footsteps fade into silence. He turned back to the room, the massive bed, the empty space beside his pillow. Her scent was everywhere, on the sheets, in the air, in the very grain of the wood. But it was the scent of memory, not of presence. He had wanted to test the limits of their bond, to push her until she clung to him, terrified of losing him. He had assumed her love was an unshakable foundation, a thing he could damage and repair at his leisure. He had never considered that she might simply lower the drawbridge, walk out, and leave him to conquer an empty castle. Standing alone in their bedroom, the Alpha King finally understood. He had not just angered her. He had not broken her spirit. He had taught her how to live without him. And in the profound, terrifying silence she left behind, he felt the first true fear of his reign. He was a king who had everything, and he was about to lose the only thing that had ever mattered. The Dowager Queen's chambers were a place frozen in amber. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the heavy velvet curtains, and the air was still and cold, carrying the faint, papery scent of dried roses and old parchment. The furniture stood like sentinels in the gloom, each piece draped in a thin veil of neglect. A vanity of polished rosewood, a writing desk with an inkwell long since dried, a silver jewelry box left exactly where the former queen had last placed it, its lid slightly ajar, as if she had only stepped out for a moment and intended to return. It was a room of ghosts, and tonight it was a sanctuary. Isolde set her small bundle on the chaise lounge and did not light a lamp. Her wolf-enhanced vision was more than enough to navigate the shadowy space, and there was something fitting about the darkness. It matched the landscape inside her. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth rosewood of the vanity, her fingers tracing the outline of the silver box. She had known Ravek's mother only through stories and the stern, regal portraits that lined the corridors. Helene Hart had been a queen forged in iron, a woman who had held the kingdom together through a civil war while her mate, the old king, had crumbled under the weight of his own demons. The court had feared her. The pack had revered her. And when she had finally closed her eyes for the last time, The entire citadel had mourned for a month. A queen's duty was to the pack, to the kingdom, to the line. Her heart was a secondary concern. Isolde had understood this abstractly on the day she accepted Ravek's mark. She had simply never imagined the duty would require her to excise her own heart with such clinical precision. The bond, their sacred connection. It was meant to be a source of strength, a wellspring of mutual support. Ravek had twisted it into a weapon, a leash he could tug whenever he wanted to feel her flinch. He had used it to test her loyalty, to satisfy his own deep-seated insecurity that she loved the man and not the crown. He had wanted to see her fight for him. But a queen did not brawl in the mud for what was already rightfully hers. A queen endured. And if endurance meant carving out the part of herself that bled when he inflicted a wound, then so be it. Her wolf, a quiet and resilient creature she rarely let surface, was not raging. It was watching, waiting. It had trusted Ravek's wolf completely, the way a mate trusts the other half of her soul. And that trust had been betrayed. Now it was coiled deep inside her, conserving its strength, its amber eyes fixed on the threat. And the threat was not Serena. The threat was the king himself. A soft knock broke the silence. Isolde turned, her posture instantly regal. Enter. The door opened a sliver, and Brielle slipped inside, carrying a tray with a steaming clay pitcher and a single cup. The girl's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her small frame trembling like a leaf in a current. "My queen," she whispered. "Lord Edric sent this. Spiced milk with honey. He said you might find the night cold." Something warm and unexpected moved through Isolde's chest. Old Edric, the grizzled elder who had served Ravek's father and grandfather before him. He had been watching her all evening from his seat at the long table, his ancient, knowing eyes missing nothing. He had not offered pity. He had not whispered condolences or shot sympathetic glances her way. He had simply observed, as he always did, and then he had acted. This was not a cup of milk. It was a message, a declaration of allegiance, not to the king's mate, but to the queen. "Thank you, Brielle," Isolde said, her voice gentle. "That was very thoughtful of him. You may set it on the table." The girl scurried to a small table by the window and set the tray down with a soft clatter. She curtsied so low her forehead nearly touched her knees, then backed out of the room, as if retreating from the den of a great wolf. Isolde sighed when the door closed. The schism was already beginning. The court had seen the king's public disrespect and her public withdrawal. Now the wolves of Heartwood were doing what wolves always did when they sensed a fracture in the leadership. They were choosing sides. She poured the warm, fragrant milk into the cup and brought it to her lips. The sweetness of the honey spread across her tongue, and for one brief moment, the cold stone in the pit of her stomach loosened its grip. She was not the weeping, broken thing they all expected her to be. The pain was there, a deep ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. But it was an old pain, a familiar companion. She had been an Omega from a lesser pack, chosen by the Alpha King for a fire he saw in her spirit. She had spent years fighting for respect, proving she was more than a pretty face to warm his bed, proving she had the mind and the will to be a true partner in his rule. Ravek's jealousy had not created this wound. It had simply ripped the careful stitches from an old one. He had, in one brutish public display, reduced her back to a possession, a thing to be goaded and tested. She took another sip of the milk and stared out at the moonlit courtyard below. Somewhere across the citadel, in the room they had once shared, the Alpha King was discovering the weight of an empty bed. She hoped it crushed him. In the armory, the scent of oiled steel leather, and cold sweat hung thick in the air. Ravek had stripped off his formal tunic and grabbed a practice sword, the familiar weight of it a small, pathetic comfort in his hands. He swung it in vicious arcs, each stroke cutting through the silence with a hum that matched the fury screaming through his veins. Darius was there. He was always there when Ravek was on the verge of destroying something irreplaceable. The king's beta sat on a low bench, sharpening a set of hunting knives by the light of a single lantern. He was a hulking, scarred wolf with hands like shovels and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. But his eyes were sharp, and his loyalty was the kind that could not be bought, bartered, or broken. He looked up as Ravek shattered a practice dummy with a blow that would have split a man in half. "Serena is gone?" Darius asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "She is," Ravek bit out, not pausing in his assault on the splintered remains. "Good. It was a fool's game, and you were losing." Ravek whirled. The tip of the practice sword stopped an inch from Darius's throat. His alpha flared, a wave of pure, unrestrained dominance that would have sent any other wolf in the kingdom to their knees. "Watch your tongue, beta." Darius did not flinch. He met the king's enraged glare without blinking, the way he had met it 100 times before, in battle, in grief, in the quiet, desperate hours before dawn, when the weight of the crown became too much to bear. "Or what?" Darius said. "You will banish me too? You are running out of people to send away, Ravek. Soon it will just be you, and this sword, and an empty hall." Ravek's arm trembled, not with the effort of holding the blade, but with the effort of holding himself together. "She left," he said, and the words came out broken. He lowered the sword, the strength drained from his arms like water from a cracked vessel. He sank onto the bench, burying his face in his hands. The scent of Serena's perfume still clung to his skin, nightshade and musk, a sickeningly sweet reminder of his own arrogance. "She took a blanket and went to my mother's chambers. She said no to me, Darius. She looked me in the eye and said no." The admission felt like swallowing glass, an alpha king, denied by his own mate, not through screaming or violence or a dramatic display of wounded pride, through a single, quiet word that carried more power than any roar he had ever unleashed. Darius set down his knife and whetstone. He walked over and sat beside his king, the bench groaning under their combined weight. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply sat, a solid, grounding presence in the chaos. "Of course she did," he said finally. "What did you expect? Isolde is not some simpering pup who will fall at your feet, grateful for a scrap of attention. You chose her for her strength. Did you honestly think she would not use it to defend herself, even from you?" "I wanted to see her fight," Ravek said, his voice muffled behind his hands. "I wanted the fire, the passion. She has been so calm, so composed, so untouchable. I felt like I was losing her to the crown, to the role. I thought if I could just make her feel something, anything, it would prove that we were still real, that the bond still mattered." Darius was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual gruffness. It was careful, almost tender, the voice of a man delivering a truth he knew would draw blood. "You did not want her to fight for you, Ravek. You wanted to control her. You felt her growing into her own power as queen, stepping into a strength that did not orbit around you, and it terrified you. So you acted like a brute. You tried to shove her back into the box she had outgrown, and she refused to go." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his scarred hands hanging between them. "You wanted to see her hurt, Because her pain was proof that you still mattered. Do you hear yourself? You wanted to wound the woman you love to soothe your own ego. That is not the act of a king. That is the act of a coward. The words landed like a fist to the sternum. Ravek could not breathe. He could not argue. Because Darius was right, and they both knew it. The bond, Darius said, his voice dropping lower. How is it? Tell me the truth. Ravek did not want to answer, but the bleakness in his own eyes betrayed him before his mouth could form a lie. Thin, he whispered, quiet. When I touch her, it is like touching a stranger. When I push through the bond, there is nothing to push against. She has pulled everything back, every emotion, every thread of connection. She has retreated behind a wall I cannot see, cannot climb, cannot break. Darius nodded slowly, his expression grim. She is shielding, pulling all of her energy, her emotion, her very essence back from you and into herself. It is a defense mechanism of last resort, Ravek. It takes immense control, immense will. A wolf only does this when they believe the bond itself is a danger to their survival. He turned to look at the king, and his eyes held no mercy, only a hard, unflinching love. You have made her feel that her connection to you, the most sacred thing between wolves, is a threat to her life. You need to fix this, not with grand gestures, not with public dismissals. That is politics. This is the heart of your kingdom, and you must fix it with humility. Humility. The word tasted foreign on Ravek's tongue. Bitter. Wrong. You go to her, Darius said simply. Not as a king, as her mate. You leave your crown at the door. You strip away every scrap of your pride. And you tell her the truth. That you were afraid. That you were a fool. That you are nothing without her. He stood, clapping a heavy hand on Ravek's shoulder. And you pray to the moon goddess that she is willing to listen. Ravek remained on the bench long after Darius left. The cold of the armory seeped into his bones, into the marrow, into the hollow spaces where certainty used to live. He was the Alpha King. He had stared down civil war, famine, and the threat of invasion without flinching. But the thought of standing before his mate's quiet, pitying eyes and admitting his own pathetic weakness terrified him more than any army ever had. The walk to the Dowager's wing was the longest journey of his life. He dismissed the guards at the end of the corridor with a curt gesture. He would approach this door alone. It was a heavy, unadorned slab of ironwood, and it promised solitude, not welcome. He raised his hand to knock and hesitated. What if she did not answer? What if she simply left him standing in the hallway like a spurned suitor? The humiliation alone nearly sent him stalking back the way he had come, but then he felt it again. The terrifying hollow space where the warm, vibrant presence of her half of the bond should have been. The void. The nothing. The void was worse than the humiliation. He knocked. 3 soft, hesitant raps of his knuckles against the wood. It was the sound of a question. Silence stretched into eternity. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears. Then, from within, a soft voice. Come in. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling like an intruder in his own citadel. The room was vast, shadowy, cold. Isolde sat in a high-backed chair near the window, the cup of spiced milk resting untouched on the table beside her. She was not reading. She was simply looking out at the moonlit courtyard, her profile a perfect, still silhouette against the glass. The moonlight silvered her dark hair and traced the elegant line of her throat. She looked unreachable, a queen in a portrait. He closed the door behind him and stayed by it, leaving the expansive room between them. He had to shed his power here. Leave it outside like a muddy cloak. Isolde. His voice was rougher than he intended. She turned her head to look at him. Her expression was unreadable. She did not invite him closer. She simply waited. "I sent Serena away," he said. "I know. The entire Citadel knows by now. It was a political move, a king reasserting control. It had nothing to do with me." "That is not true. It had everything to do with you." "Did it?" she asked, and the genuine, dispassionate curiosity in her voice was more painful than any accusation. "Or did it have to do with the fact that my reaction was not what you wanted? You did not get the tears, the anger. You got silence, and that, it seems, you could not control. So you removed the pawn you were using. The game remains the same." She saw his motives with such clarity it was as if she had peeled back his skin and read the frantic pulse of his veins. There was nowhere to hide. The truth. Darius had said the truth was the only path. And so, Ravek stepped onto it. "I was afraid." The admission tore from his throat, raw and ugly. He walked further into the room, stopping near the cold, cavernous fireplace. He could not look at her. He stared into the blackness of the hearth instead. "I felt a distance growing between us, not in the bond, but here." He touched his chest. "You were becoming more the queen every day, serene, composed, untouchable. I felt like I was losing the woman I mated, the one with the fire and the temper, the one who fought with me and for me." He risked a glance at her. She was listening, her head tilted slightly, her hands folded in her lap. The games with Serena, the public displays. I thought it would provoke that fire. I thought jealousy would make you fight for us, remind you of what we had. His voice dropped to something barely audible. "I wanted to see you hurt, Isolde, because your pain would have been proof that I still mattered, that we still mattered." He finally met her eyes and let her see the desperate, pathetic truth. It was the act of a fool, a coward. I was testing a bond that should have been my anchor, and I have shattered it. For the first time, a shadow of emotion crossed her face. It was a profound, aching sadness that made his chest constrict. She stood and walked to the window, placing a hand against the cold glass, her back to him. "You speak of my fire," she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Did you ever consider why it began to fade?" She paused, and the silence between them was a living thing. "That fire you loved was the tool of a woman fighting for her place. I fought the court's whispers that I was unworthy. I fought the skepticism of the pack elders. I fought to be seen as your partner, not just your prize. And I thought, fool that I was, that I had finally won, that I could rest, that I could be the calm, steady queen our people needed, because I had a king at my side who saw me, who knew my worth." She turned, and her eyes were not still anymore. They were shimmering with a deep, controlled pain that she held in place through sheer force of will. "But I was wrong. The moment I stopped fighting everyone else, you started a fight of your own. You did not see my peace as a victory, Ravek. You saw it as a threat. You could not stand a queen who did not need to be protected, who did not need to be reassured. You needed the struggling girl you first met, not the woman she became." Each word was a surgical incision, not meant to wound, but to expose the truth underneath. "You wanted me to fight?" she continued, and her voice gained a quiet, terrible strength. "I am fighting. I am fighting for my own sanity. I am fighting to hold myself together when the bond that is meant to be my strength is the source of my deepest wound. I am fighting for the dignity you tried to strip from me in front of our entire court." She took a breath, and the composure settled back over her like armor. "My fight is just quieter than you are used to. And right now, I am fighting to keep a wall between myself and the man who wields his love like a weapon. The man who wields his love like a weapon. Ravek stood motionless. He had never seen it that way. He had seen his actions as a desperate attempt to reclaim intimacy, not as an act of emotional violence, but she had named it, and now it lived in the air between them, undeniable. "Let me fix this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell me what to do. I will do anything." He reached for her. His fingers brushed her arm. She pulled back as if his touch were a brand. "You cannot fix this, Ravek," she said, and her voice was impossibly gentle, which was the cruelest sound he had ever heard. "Because I am not a broken vase you can glue back together. You did not just hurt me. You showed me who you are, a king who fears his queen's strength, a mate who will deliberately cause pain to soothe his own ego. That knowledge cannot be unlearned." "I can change," he vowed. "Can you?" The question hung in the cold, still air. "I hope so, for the sake of the kingdom, but I cannot allow my own survival to be contingent on that hope." She walked to the chaise lounge and sat down, picking up the now cool cup of milk. It was a dismissal. The audience was over. "I will not leave the citadel," she said, her voice gaining the precise, measured cadence of a monarch dictating terms. "I will not abandon my duties or my people, but I will not return to your bed. I will not return to the pretense that we are mates in the way we were. That is gone, Ravek. Perhaps forever." She met his gaze. "We can be king and queen, a united front for the kingdom. We will rule together. We will protect this pact together. We will be allies, partners in governance. But the couple that shared a soul, they are a casualty of the war you started. That is my price for staying." Every instinct, every fiber of his alpha being screamed at him to refuse. His wolf was clawing at the inside of his ribs, enraged by the terms of this cold, loveless truce. But he looked at her face, at the profound, unshakable resolve in her eyes, and he knew the path back to what they had been was sealed shut. He could accept the new reality she was offering, or he could lose her entirely. Slowly, agonizingly, he released the last thread of his resistance. "If king and queen are all I am allowed to have of you," he said, each word a shard of glass in his throat, "then I will accept those terms." The surrender cost him everything, more than a pound of flesh, more than a pint of blood. It was the price of his heart, laid on the cold stone floor of his dead mother's room. Isolde watched him leave. She listened to his heavy footsteps fade down the corridor until the silence swallowed them whole. Then, and only then, did she lower the cup from her lips, with a hand that was no longer steady. The wall she had built around her heart was holding. But behind it, in the dark and private space, where no one could see, something was bleeding, not breaking. She would not allow herself to break, but bleeding, yes. A slow, quiet hemorrhage that no amount of will could fully staunch. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and closed her eyes. Isolde did not hide. That was the first thing the Citadel learned about its queen on the morning after the night that split the kingdom's heart in two. She did not barricade herself in the dowager's chambers. She did not send a servant to fetch her meals. She did not wrap herself in mourning clothes and wait for the court to forget. She dressed in a sturdy gown of dark gray wool, practical and unadorned, the kind of garment a woman wore when she intended to work, not to be admired. She braided her hair back in a severe, elegant coronet that left her face exposed, her jaw set, her dark eyes clear of everything except purpose. And she walked out of the dowager's wing and into the cold morning light as if the previous night had been nothing more than an unremarkable evening followed by a restful sleep. Her destination was deliberate, Not the great hall, where the courtiers would be whispering over their breakfast porridge. Not the council chambers, where Ravek's presence would hang in the air like smoke. She went to the outer training yard, the wide, muddy expanse of packed earth and wooden palisades where the new conscripts were being drilled for the winter patrols. It was a public place, but not a political one. It was a place of sweat and effort, and the honest, unglamorous work of keeping a kingdom safe. It was a place of strength. She arrived to a scene of controlled chaos. The clang of practiced swords echoed off the stone walls, punctuated by the grunts and shouts of young wolves who were still learning the difference between holding a blade and using one. Darius was overseeing the drills from the center of the yard, his voice a bellow that cut through the noise like a war horn, his scarred face twisted into an expression of permanent dissatisfaction that the recruits had learned was actually his version of encouragement. And on the upper rampart, standing with his hands on the stone parapet and his golden eyes fixed on the yard below, was Ravek. He saw her the moment she stepped through the gate. She felt his gaze land on her like a hand pressed against her spine, a weight that was both familiar and unwelcome. The bond, thin and taut as a wire, stretched between two cliffs, vibrated with his shock, his question, his desperate, unspoken plea. She did not look up at him. She did not acknowledge his presence. She simply moved along the edge of the yard with measured, purposeful strides, stopping to observe the drills, offering a quiet word to a struggling youth whose grip on his sword was all wrong, nodding her approval to the drill master when a particularly complex formation was executed cleanly. She was claiming her territory. She was showing every wolf in Heartwood that their queen was not broken, not hiding, not cowering in a dead woman's room waiting for her king to decide her fate. She was present. She was working. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The effect was immediate. The young wolves trained harder, their movements sharper, their focus keener. They were aware of the two poles of power in their kingdom, standing 100 feet apart, connected by a chasm of silence that crackled with unspoken history. The queen on the ground, the king on the wall, neither yielding, neither retreating. It was Lord Edric who noticed the change in Isolde's posture first. The old wolf had positioned himself on a bench near the armory entrance, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, his ancient eyes watching everything with the patient, predatory attention of a hawk circling a field. He had seen queens come and go. He had watched Ravek's mother hold this kingdom together with nothing but will and fury. And now he was watching another queen find her footing on ground that had been cut from beneath her. He approved. He approved enormously. It was into this charged atmosphere that Lord Theron of the Ashval Pack arrived. He came through the main gate with the swagger of a man who believed the world existed primarily for his convenience. He was a hulking, black-furred brute of an alpha, broad across the shoulders and thick through the neck, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from the aftermath of several violent disagreements with other wolves' fists. Old scars crisscrossed his jaw and cheekbone, souvenirs of border skirmishes and dominance challenges that he wore like medals. His eyes were small, dark, and cunning, the eyes of a predator that preferred to circle its prey rather than charge it. He was escorted by two of Ravek's guards, but he walked as if he owned the stones beneath his feet. He greeted Ravek on the rampart with a loud, overly familiar clap on the shoulder and a booming laugh that carried across the yard. Their exchange was brief, the kind of diplomatic pleasantry that meant nothing and said everything. Two alphas measuring each other through smiles that did not reach their eyes. Isolde continued her inspection. She did not turn. She did not react. She was aware of Theron the way a deer is aware of a wolf in the tree line. with every nerve and instinct on alert beneath a surface of absolute calm. Then Theron descended into the yard. His heavy boots crunched on the gravel with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm, the sound of a man who wanted to be heard. The young wolves near Isolde fell back instinctively, their heads bowed, their bodies shrinking in the presence of a visiting alpha whose dominance radiated from him like heat from a forge. He walked directly toward her. "My queen," he boomed, his voice oozing a false deference that dripped like honey over something rotten. He took her hand before she could withdraw it, his grip too tight, too proprietary, and bowed low to press his lips against her knuckles. His scent was acrid, of pine rot and old blood and something else, something calculated and cold beneath the surface bravado. "A vision of serenity," he said, straightening, his small eyes raking over her face with an assessment that was equal parts dismissal and appetite. "Your king is a fortunate male to have such a calm, dutiful female to manage his household." The insult was multi-layered and deliberate. Female, not queen. Dutiful, not powerful. Manage his household, not rule beside him. Every word was a needle, carefully placed to diminish, to reduce, to remind her of the rank the world had assigned her before a king's mark had rewritten the ledger. He was assuming that her silence at the feast was the mark of a cowed, submissive Omega, and he was treating her accordingly. Isolde slowly, deliberately, pulled her hand from his grasp. She met his small, cunning eyes with a gaze as cold and sharp as the edge of a winter river. She did not raise her voice. She did not bristle or puff or bare her teeth. She simply looked at him with the quiet, devastating composure that had become her most lethal weapon. "Lord Theron," she said, and her voice carried across the training yard with the clarity of a bell struck in a silent cathedral. "Your pack's tribute is late this season, by 3 weeks, if my records are accurate, and they are always accurate. I trust the Ashval forests are not so depleted that you cannot meet your obligations to the crown." The smile on Theron's face curdled. He had expected a blush, a stammer, a flutter of eyelashes, perhaps even a grateful curtsy for the honor of his attention. Instead, he had received a reminder of his vassalage from the woman he had just dismissed as a housekeeper. She had not just deflected his insult. She had buried a blade in his pride and twisted it with a smile. From the rampart above, Ravik had gone rigid. Every muscle in his body was coiled, his wolf a raging inferno just beneath his skin. He had heard the insult. He had seen the way Theron touched her, the way his eyes had moved over her body with the casual possessiveness of a man appraising livestock. But he did not roar. He did not issue a king's command. He gripped the stone parapet so hard his knuckles went white, and he waited, because Darius's words were still echoing in his skull. Not as a king, as her mate. But Theron was not finished. The public humiliation of being corrected by an Omega Queen had ignited something ugly behind those small, dark eyes. He leaned closer to Isolde, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl that was still loud enough for every wolf within 20 feet to hear. A queen should concern herself with pups, not politics. Perhaps if you warmed your king's bed more effectively, he would not look so strained. Or perhaps, he paused, and a cruel, knowing smile spread across his scarred face. Perhaps the problem is not the bed, but the womb. A barren Omega has no business lecturing her betters about debts. The word hit like a fist. Barren. It exploded in the space between them, and every wolf in the training yard heard it. Felt it. The young conscripts flinched. Darius's hand went to his sword hilt. Lord Edric rose from his bench, his ancient face darkening with a fury that made him look 30 years younger. And Isolde flinched. It was small, a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles around her eyes, a micro tremor in her jaw, an involuntary catch of breath that she corrected almost instantly. To anyone watching casually, she might have simply blinked against the wind, but Ravek saw it. Across the distance, through the noise and the dust and the cold morning air, he saw the one crack in the armor his mate had spent years forging. He saw the wound that Theron's word had found, the private grief that she had buried so deep that even Ravek had never dared to name it out loud. The empty nursery, the tiny shoes in the drawer, the child who never came. He saw his mate hurt, and something inside him that was older than thought, older than pride, older than the crown itself, detonated. He did not shout. He did not roar a challenge from the rampart. There was simply a blur of motion, a shadow, moving with a speed that was terrifying in its silence, and then Ravek was no longer on the wall. He was between Isolde and Theron, a living shield of coiled muscle and barely contained violence. He had covered the distance, the stairway, the full length of the training yard in the span of 3 heartbeats. No one had seen him move. He had simply appeared the way lightning appears, without warning and with devastating intent. "Theron," Ravek said. His voice was soft. That was the terrifying thing. It was not a roar. It was not a bellow. It was the quiet, intimate tone of a man who has moved past anger into something far more dangerous. "You are a guest in my lands. You have insulted my queen. Apologize to her." It was not a request. The air crackled with an alpha presence so immense, so concentrated, that the entire training yard fell silent. The young wolves froze where they stood, their practice swords hanging forgotten at their sides, their eyes wide with the primal terror of prey caught in the gaze of an apex predator. Even Darius, who had weathered Ravek's fury more times than he could count, felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Theron, caught off guard, bristled with the automatic, reflexive aggression of an alpha whose territory has been invaded. He drew himself up to his full height, which was considerable, and bared his teeth. "I will not apologize for speaking the truth to a Baron Omega who forgets her place." The word again. Baron. Thrown like a torch into dry timber. Ravek did not answer with words. His right hand shot out with a speed that defied his size, an open palm strike that connected with Theron's throat with pinpoint, brutal precision. The Ashval Alpha gagged, his eyes bulging, his hands clawing at his neck as he stumbled backward. Before he could recover, before his body could even process the first blow, Ravek was inside his guard. A knee drove into Theron's groin with enough force to lift the larger wolf off his feet. A disabling strike to the shoulder tore a scream from Theron's throat as the joint separated with a wet, sickening pop. And then Theron was on the ground, face down in the gravel, Ravek's knee in his spine, and a dagger pressed to the scarred skin of his cheek. Theron's 2 guards started forward, hands on their weapons, but they froze when Darius stepped into their path. The King's Beta drew his own massive blade with a menacing rasp of steel on leather and simply stood there, a mountain of scarred muscle and quiet lethality, his expression suggesting that he would be deeply, personally delighted if they gave him a reason. They did not. "The next words from your mouth," Ravek snarled, his face inches from the terrified alpha pinned beneath him, "will be an apology to Queen Isolde, or they will be your last." Theron, gasping, his dislocated shoulder sending waves of white-hot agony through his body, stared up at the sheer, lethal promise in the king's eyes. This was not the strained, distracted ruler he had come to test. This was not the king whose mate had been publicly displaced and whose weakness was the subject of whispered speculation in every hall from here to the eastern mountains. This was the Heartwood Alpha in his primal, unrestrained fury. A wolf defending his mate. And there was no force in the world more dangerous. "I apologize, my queen," Theron choked out, his voice a wet, strangled rasp. His eyes, wide with pain and fear, found Isolde where she stood motionless at the edge of the yard. Ravek pressed the dagger deeper, drawing a thin line of blood along Theron's cheekbone. Again, with the respect she is owed. "I apologize, Your Majesty," Theron wheezed. Ravek stood, pulling the blade back. He looked down at the defeated Alpha with a contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. "You are no longer a guest. You are a trespasser. Darius will escort you to the border. If you or any wolf bearing the Ashval sigil sets foot in my lands again, I will mount your head on a spike at the main gate." He turned his back on Theron, the ultimate gesture of dismissal, and faced Isolde. His chest was heaving, the adrenaline of the violence still coursing through him like wildfire through dry brush. And it was only then that she saw it. A dark, wet stain spreading across the left side of his tunic, just below his ribs. In the fury of his attack, in the single-minded focus of a mate protecting the other half of his soul, he had ignored Theron's desperate, flailing defense. The Ashval Alpha had been wearing a bladed vambrace, a concealed weapon strapped to his forearm, and its edge had sliced a deep, ragged gash along Ravek's ribs as he closed the distance. He had bled to defend her honor. Not the crown's honor, not his own pride. Hers. The healers started forward, but Isolde raised a hand, and they stopped. She looked at the blood soaking through his tunic. She looked at his face, at the pain he was ignoring, at the question in his golden eyes that he did not dare ask out loud. Was it enough? Did it matter? "Do you see me?" Something moved behind the wall. Not a crack, not yet, but a shift in the foundation, the deep tectonic kind that precedes a change so fundamental it cannot be undone. This was not the arrogant king from the feast hall. This was not the desperate man from the dowager's chambers. This was a glimpse, brief and blinding, of the mate she had lost. The wolf who would bleed without thinking, without calculating, without weighing the political cost, simply because someone had hurt her. "You are injured, my king," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him since the night she walked out of their bedroom. Her fingers were cool and firm against the heat of his skin, and the contact sent a jolt through the bond that made them both catch their breath. "Come, you need to be tended to." The healer's chambers smelled of antiseptic herbs, clean linen, and the faint metallic tang of fresh blood. It was a place stripped of pretense, where rank and title meant nothing, and the only thing that mattered was the integrity of flesh and bone. Isolde led Ravek to the main room and closed the door behind them. The head healer, old Marin, whose gnarled hands had stitched more wounds than she could remember, rushed forward with bandages and a basin of steaming water. "Clear the room," Isolde said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that stopped Marin mid-stride. "I will tend to the king myself." Marin's eyes went wide. To tend an alpha's wounds was an intimate act, a task reserved for a mate or a trusted healer. It was a declaration, a claim, not of love, not of forgiveness, but of something more primal. "This is my king. His body is under my protection." Ravek's head snapped up, his gaze locking with Isolde's. He had expected her to hand him off to the healers and retreat. This was something he had not anticipated and did not know how to receive. "Go," Isolde said to Marin without breaking eye contact with Ravek. The old healer bowed and ushered her apprentices out, closing the door with a soft click that sealed the two of them in silence. "Sit," Isolde commanded, "and take that off." He obeyed. He sat on the edge of a low cot and pulled the torn, blood-soaked tunic over his head with a grimace that he could not entirely suppress. The wound was worse than she had thought. A deep, ragged gash that ran along his lower ribs, welling with dark blood that caught the lamplight. It would need stitches, many of them. She gathered the supplies with methodical, dispassionate efficiency. Clean cloth, hot water, needle, gut thread, comfrey salve. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She was a queen performing a duty. Nothing more. But when she turned back to him, when the full proximity of his body hit her, the heat radiating from his bare skin, the scent of him, winter air and cedar, and the raw metallic tang of his blood, something inside her clenched. Her hands, which had been so perfectly steady, trembled for a fraction of a second. She pressed the warm cloth to the edges of the wound. Ravek hissed, his abdominal muscles contracting under her touch, but he did not pull away. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made the air between them hum. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze fixed on her work. She was not asking about Serena anymore. They had moved beyond that. "He insulted you." "Men like Theron have been insulting me since the day you chose me," she said, her voice flat. "They see a lowborn Omega. They always will. It is the price of my station." "He called you Baron." The word hung in the air between them. She stopped. The needle hovered above his skin. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. "He used our private grief as a public weapon against you," Ravek said, and his voice was a low growl of remembered fury. His hand rose from his side, hovering in the air as if he wanted to touch her face, but he stopped himself. He let it fall back. A small, conscious act of restraint, and she noticed it. "He took a pain that belongs only to us and tried to turn it into your shame. I would have killed him for that. I still might. Our private grief, a pain that belongs to us." Her hands stilled. He had never spoken of it so plainly. Their inability to conceive had been a silent wound, a shared weight carried in separate silences. She had always feared in the darkest corner of her heart that he saw it as her failure alone. An Omega's failing. A defect in the woman he had chosen against the advice of every elder in the kingdom. But his words reframed it. Not her grief, their grief. Not her failure, their loss. She picked up the needle and began to stitch. Her movements were precise, each pass of the thread pulling the torn edges of his flesh together with a care that bordered on tenderness, despite the clinical efficiency of her technique. Her fingers brushed his skin with each stitch, and every contact was a fresh jolt to the dormant bond, like touching a live wire buried under years of silence. She could feel his strength, the raw power thrumming beneath the surface. But she could also feel his vulnerability, his absolute stillness as he submitted to her care. He was trusting her not just to heal his body, but to be this close without using the proximity as a weapon. When she tied off the last stitch and snipped the thread, she began to dress the wound with the comfrey salve, her fingers tracing the line of her own handiwork. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. The scent of herbs and blood and the heat of his skin filled the small room until there was no air left that did not taste of him. "It is done," she said, and her voice was a little breathless despite herself. She began to pull away. His hand moved. Not fast, not forceful. His fingers wrapped around her wrist with a gentleness that was almost worse than force. It was a plea written in skin and bone. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the contrast of his broad, calloused fingers against the fine bones beneath her skin. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw. "I was doing my duty." "No." His grip tightened slightly. "You could have let Marin do this. You chose to. You chose to touch me. You chose to stay. I know what that cost you." The wall shifted again, not crumbling, not falling. But a second stone moved beside the first, and through the gap between them, something warm and agonizing leaked through. He was not just seeing her actions. He was seeing the battle behind them. He understood the sacrifice. "Let me go, Ravek," she whispered, but the words carried no force. They were a question, not a command. "I cannot," he confessed. "If I let go now, you will walk out that door, and I will lose you again. I will feel you retreat behind that wall, and I do not know if I have the strength to survive that silence a second time." She stood frozen, his hand a manacle of heat and desperation around her wrist. A king, wounded and bleeding on a cot, begging his queen not to leave him. He had stripped away his crown, his pride, his anger. All that was left was the man, the mate, the wolf who had made a catastrophic mistake and was now sitting in the wreckage with blood on his skin and terror in his eyes. Isolde did not pull away, but she did not lean in. She turned her hand slowly, a deliberate movement until her palm rested against his. Not an embrace, not forgiveness, an acknowledgement. "Letting go is not the same as leaving, Ravek," she said softly, "but holding on does not fix what is broken." She let her hand rest against his for 3 heartbeats. Then she gently, carefully withdrew. She set his hand down on his knee, her fingers lingering for one final second before breaking contact. "The wound will hold," she said, her voice returning to its composed, queenly register. "Have Marin check the stitches in the morning, and try not to tear them open by doing something heroic." It was not a joke, but it was the closest thing to warmth she had offered him since the night of the feast, and they both felt it. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. "Ravek." "Yes." She did not turn around. "What you did today, in the yard, that was not about your pride." "No." "I know." A beat of silence. "I noticed." She opened the door and walked out, her footsteps steady, her back straight, the scent of his blood still warm on her fingers. Behind her, Ravek sat on the cot in the empty healer's room, his hand pressed flat against the place on his wrist where her pulse had touched his, and he breathed. The bond between them was still thin, still fragile, still more scar tissue than living connection. But for the first time since the night she had walked out of their bedroom, it was not silent. It was humming. A low, tentative vibration, like the first note of a song that someone was learning to remember. It was not warmth. It was not forgiveness. But it was alive. But that was tomorrow's war. Tonight, there was this. A crack in the wall, a hum in the bond, and the faintest, most fragile suggestion that what had been broken might, against all reason, still have a pulse. The sealed scroll hit the council table with the weight of a death sentence. Ravek broke the wax with his thumb, the Ashval sigil crumbling like dried blood beneath his nail. His eyes moved across the cramped, urgent handwriting, and with each line, something behind his expression hardened into stone. The great council chamber was still warm from the hearth fires, still carrying the fading scent of roasted meat and mulled wine from the evening meal, but a new cold had entered the room. Not the cold of winter, the cold of war. The elders were already assembled, roused from their beds by runners who had pounded on their chamber doors with the kind of urgency that left no room for protest. Lord Edric sat at the far end of the table, his ancient face carved from shadow and firelight, his gnarled hands folded before him with the patience of a man who had survived enough crises to know that panic was a luxury the powerful could not afford. Beside him, Lord Brennan, broad-shouldered and blunt-featured, drummed his thick fingers against the oak in a rhythm that betrayed his agitation. Darius stood behind Ravek's chair, a silent monolith of scarred muscle and watchful eyes, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword with the casual readiness of a wolf who slept with one ear turned toward the door. "Theron has not returned to Grimhalt," Ravek said, his voice flat and controlled, the voice of a king delivering facts he wished were lies. He has rallied his banners at the northern border. His war chiefs claim a debt of blood for the slight against his honor. They are calling for retribution. He spread the scroll flat on the table so the council could see the crude map scratched into the margins. Red marks indicated troop positions. A thick line had been drawn across the narrow throat of the quarry, passed like a blade across a neck. He is blockading the old quarry pass, cutting off our winter trade route with the Iron Ridge clans. A murmur rippled through the assembled wolves, low and anxious, the sound of men calculating losses they could not afford. The quarry pass was the kingdom's lifeline during the frozen months. It was the only route wide enough for supply wagons to move between Heartwood and the Allied territories to the east. The road that carried grain, salt, dried meat, medicinal herbs, and the heavy timber needed to repair shelters before the deepest snows arrived. Without it, the citadel would be an island in a sea of white. The stores Isolde had so carefully inventoried, the ones she had spent weeks organizing and rationing, would not stretch far enough. The elderly would suffer first, then the children, then the wolves who patrolled the outer territories with nothing but fur and stubbornness between them and the killing cold. And Theron knew it. He was not a brilliant strategist, but he was a patient, cunning predator who understood that you did not need to kill a wolf to defeat it. You only needed to starve it. Isolde stood at the far end of the table. She had arrived before any of the elders, summoned by a runner who had found her in the dowager's chambers, where she had been sitting by the window in the dark, unable to sleep. She wore the same practical gray wool she had worn to the training yard, her hair still braided in its severe coronet, her face scrubbed clean of any artifice. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there 2 days ago, bruises of exhaustion painted by sleepless hours and the relentless effort of holding herself together. But her gaze was sharp and clear, the gaze of a woman who had long ago learned that falling apart was a privilege she could not afford. She studied the map in silence while the elders argued around her. She traced the lines of the quarry pass with her eyes, measuring distances, calculating travel times, reading the terrain the way a healer reads the veins beneath the skin. "We must respond with overwhelming force," Lord Brennan declared, his fist striking the table hard enough to make the inkwell jump. "Ride out at first light with every mounted warrior in the citadel. Crush the blockade before Theron can dig his claws in deeper." "A winter campaign is costly," Lord Edric countered. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a man who had buried too many young wolves in frozen ground. "Theron is a stubborn beast in his own forests. He knows every ravine, every ridge, every frozen stream crossing. He has had days to prepare, days we spent arguing amongst ourselves while he was sharpening his blades." The barb was subtle, but it found its mark. Several elders glanced at Ravek, then quickly away. Ravek's hands were flat on the table, his shoulders rigid beneath the dark leather of his tunic. The bandage around his ribs, hastily applied by Marin after Isolde had stitched the wound, was a dull white line visible where his collar shifted. He had not slept either, The scent of exhaustion clung to him like smoke, undercut by something sharper, the acrid metallic edge of a wolf whose pride had been stripped to the bone and was now running on nothing but duty and adrenaline. "I will ride out at dawn with my honor guard," he said. "We will break his line at the pass." It was a king's declaration, absolute, final, the kind of statement that was meant to end discussion, not begin it. It was the obvious move, the expected move, the move that every alpha in the history of the Hart lineage would have made. Ride out, show force, crush the challenger. But the room did not fall silent the way it should have. Instead, every set of eyes drifted, slowly, inevitably, to the woman standing at the opposite end of the table. Isolde felt their gazes land on her like the weight of falling snow. One flake was nothing. 100 was an avalanche. They were watching for hesitation, for a crack in the facade, for any sign that the fracture between their king and queen would splinter their response to this threat. They had all heard the whispers. They had all seen the empty chair at the high table, the queen's retreat to the dowager's wing, the king's wounded side, and the blood on the training yard gravel. They knew their rulers were at war with each other, and now an external war had arrived to test whether the internal one had left them too broken to fight. Isolde would give them nothing of the kind. She straightened to her full height, which was not considerable, but the authority she projected had nothing to do with inches, and everything to do with the steel in her spine. "A king's honor guard is a powerful symbol," she said, and her voice cut through the murmuring like a blade through silk, calm, clear, unhurried. Each word placed with the precision of a chess piece on a board she had been studying while everyone else was still arguing about the rules. But Theron expects a symbol. He is waiting for the royal banner to appear at the mouth of the pass. He has likely laid traps, prepared positions on the high ground, stationed his best archers where the road narrows between the cliff walls. She moved to the great map of the territories, the one painted on stretched hide and pinned to a wooden frame that dominated the center of the table. Her finger found the main road to the Quarry Pass, the wide, obvious route that any army would take. She traced it slowly, letting every eye in the room follow. "He wants you to come roaring down this road, Ravek. He is counting on your pride to make you predictable." The use of his name, not his title, sent a ripple of tension through the room. It was a small thing, an intimacy that should not have been remarkable between mates, but in the charged atmosphere of the council chamber, it carried a weight that made several elders shift in their seats. Ravek's eyes locked on hers across the length of the table. She held his gaze without flinching. "But he has forgotten something," she continued, and her hand moved north on the map, away from the main road, to a thin, winding line that snaked through a vast expanse of dark green. The Whisperwood, an ancient forest of towering pines and dense undergrowth that stretched for 50 miles along the northern border, a place of deep snow, treacherous footing, and a silence so complete it could drive a wolf mad. No army had marched through the Whisperwood in winter in living memory. It was considered impassable. "While our king makes a great show of force here," she said, tapping the main road, "I will take a small, fast-moving party of our best rangers through the Whisperwood. 12 wolves, light packs. No wagons, no banners, no horns. We will move through the forest in 3 days and come around behind his blockade." Her finger completed the arc on the map, sweeping from the Whisperwood down to the rear of Theron's position at the Quarry Pass. The pincer closed like the jaws of a trap. "He is expecting a hammer," she said, and she looked up from the map. Her eyes swept every face in the room, and in each one she saw the moment comprehension arrived. We will give him a hammer and an anvil, and when the anvil strikes, he will have nowhere to run. Silence filled the chamber, not the silence of doubt, but of revelation. The kind of silence that fills a room when someone says the thing that everyone needed to hear, but no one had the clarity to articulate. Lord Edric was the first to break it. He brought his gnarled fist down on the table with a force that rattled the goblets and sent a candlestick teetering. A pincer movement, he said, and his voice was thick with something that sounded like pride. By the moon goddess, the Ashval wolf will not know what hit him. Lord Brennan, who 5 minutes earlier had been advocating for a head-on charge, was leaning over the map with new interest, tracing the Whisperwood route with his finger, nodding slowly. The other elders murmured their agreement, skepticism dissolving like morning frost under the force of a plan that was not just bold, but elegant. Revek stared at her from across the table. She had not just supported his decision to fight. She had taken his blunt instrument of a plan and transformed it into something surgical, something brilliant. She had done it publicly, in front of the entire council, binding herself to his cause more tightly than any vow while simultaneously demonstrating that she was not his subordinate, but his equal, his other half, the mind to his muscle. And she had done it without once looking at him for approval. But Isolde was not finished. There is another matter, she said, and something in her tone made the warmth drain from the room. The elders, who had been nodding and murmuring with renewed confidence, went still. One that concerns the origin of this conflict. She paused, letting the silence build, letting it press against the walls of the chamber like water rising behind a dam. Serena of Iron Ridge was dismissed from the Citadel 2 nights ago. She was escorted to the eastern gate with instructions to return to her packlands. Isolde placed her finger on the map on the territory marked with the Iron Ridge sigil. It lay to the southeast, a 3-day ride through gentle foothills and open grassland. Iron Ridge lies here. Her finger moved. However, a border patrol reported seeing a woman matching her description traveling north on the Old Forest Road the following morning. Not southeast toward her home. Her finger traced the road upward, past the river fork, past the crumbling watchtower at Millstone Ridge, past the frozen marshes where the land began to rise toward the dark, forested mountains. It stopped on a territory marked with crossed axes. North, toward Ashval. The implication settled over the council like a funeral shroud. Isolde's voice did not waver. It carried the calm, factual precision of a queen presenting evidence before a court of law. Serena did not come to Heartwood because she was drawn to the king's company. She came because she was sent, by Theron, to exploit a vulnerability he had identified from afar, to create a rift between the king and queen of Heartwood, to weaken this kingdom from within its own walls, before he moved against it from without. She let the words breathe. Let every elder, every advisor, every wolf in that room follow the thread to its inevitable, damning conclusion. Let them see the full picture, the one she had been assembling in silence while they had all been distracted by the spectacle of a king and his wounded pride. The feast, the public humiliation, the discord between the crown and its queen. None of it was spontaneous. It was engineered, and it nearly worked. She did not look at Ravek when she said it. She did not need to. The silence from his end of the table was absolute. She could feel the bond between them flood with something she had not felt from him in weeks. Not anger, not dominance, not the desperate, grasping need that had characterized his every interaction with her since the night of the feast. Shame. pure, scalding, annihilating shame that burned through the thin connection between them like acid through cloth. He had not just humiliated his mate. He had not just damaged his bond. He had played directly into the hands of an enemy who had read his insecurities like an open book and exploited them with the precision of a master tactician. His jealousy, his need for control, his pathetic games with another woman. They had not been a private failure. They had been a strategic vulnerability, and Theron had driven a blade straight through it. The kingdom he had sworn to protect had been endangered not by an external enemy, but by the weakness of its own king. And the woman he had tried to break was the one who had seen through it all. The elders were looking at him now, not with contempt. These were loyal wolves who had served the Heartline for decades, but there was a quiet, uncomfortable awareness in their eyes, the look of men who had just realized that the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they had believed. Ravek said nothing for a long, terrible moment. The fire crackled in the hearth. A log shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled in the distance, a long, mournful sound that the wind carried through the stone walls. Then he straightened, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, stripped of pride, stripped of posturing, stripped of everything except the raw truth. The Queen's assessment is correct. The words fell like stones into still water. We were targeted, and I was the weapon they used against us. My actions, my choices, created the opening that Theron exploited. That failure is mine, and it will not happen again. He paused, and the cost of those words was written in the tight line of his jaw, the white of his knuckles against the dark wood, the rigid set of his shoulders as he bore the weight of a confession he could never take back. The Queen's strategy is sound. We move at dawn. Lord Brennan, assemble the vanguard. Darius, select the rangers for the Queen's party. The fastest, the toughest, the ones who know the Whisperwood. Lord Edric, you will hold the citadel in our absence. The chamber erupted into motion. Elders rose, orders were given, runners dispatched into the corridors with the urgency of arrows loosed from a bow. The machinery of war, rusted by months of internal strife, ground back to life with a sound like thunder rolling across the mountains. The room emptied in minutes, leaving behind the scent of ink and candle smoke and the fading echo of boots on stone. And then it was just the two of them. Ravek stood on one side of the great table. Isolde stood on the other. Between them lay the map, marked with roads and rivers and the thin, winding line through the Whisperwood that she would walk tomorrow. He did not try to close the distance. He did not reach for her. He had learned, painfully and at great cost, that the space between them was hers to govern. The Whisperwood in winter, he said quietly. 3 days through that forest, in the snow, with a dozen wolves. Yes, it has not been done in a generation. The cold alone could kill half your party before you reach the other side. Then I will choose wolves who do not die easily. A ghost of something crossed his face, not a smile, something sadder and more complex, something that lived in the space between admiration and terror. You could send a commander, he said. You do not have to lead it yourself. I do, she said. Her voice was simple, certain, the voice of a woman who had already made her peace with the risk. A commander follows orders. I need wolves who will follow a queen. There is a difference. He held her gaze across the length of that table, across the map of their kingdom, across the vast and painful distance that his own hands had carved between them. And in his eyes, she saw something she had not expected. Not the desperate, possessive need of the past weeks. not the raw, humiliated shame of a man who had just been publicly undone. Something quieter, something that looked, against every reasonable expectation, like respect. Real respect. The kind that is not given because of a title or a bond or an obligation, but because it has been earned, inch by painful inch, in the proven ground of action. "Will you stand with me?" he asked. And the question was not a command. It was not a plea. It was one ruler asking another for an alliance on the eve of battle. Isolde looked at this man, her mate, her king, the source of her deepest wound and the other half of a bond she could still feel humming in the marrow of her bones. He was flawed. He was proud. He had nearly cost them everything. His ego had been the doorway through which their enemy had walked, and the wreckage of his choices was still smoldering around them. But he was also standing here, in the ruins, not making excuses, not deflecting blame, not commanding or demanding or using the bond to pull her closer. He was asking, and asking, for a man who had spent his entire life commanding, was perhaps the bravest thing he had ever done. It was not enough, not nearly enough to rebuild what he had destroyed, but it was a foundation, a single stone laid in the rubble. And Isolde was wise enough to know that even the greatest fortress began with a single stone. "As your queen," she said, "always." She gathered the scrolls from the table, tucked them beneath her arm, and walked out of the chamber. She did not look back. She had never been the kind of woman who looked back. Tomorrow she would ride into the Whisperwood with 12 rangers and a plan etched into her mind like a battle scar. Tomorrow she would bet her life and the lives of 12 wolves who had chosen to follow her on a path that the world had declared impossible. But tonight, as she walked the cold corridor toward the dowager's chambers, her boots echoing against the stone in a steady, solitary rhythm, she allowed herself one small, private truth. The wall around her heart had not crumbled. It stood as tall and thick as the day she had built it, mortared with pain and reinforced with the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had learned what it cost to love without armor. But somewhere deep within it, in a place she could not quite name, a single stone had shifted. Not fallen, not removed, just shifted, the smallest fraction of an inch, letting in a sliver of cold air from the other side. And on the other side of that wall, standing in the dark with nothing but his shame and his hope, and the thin, trembling thread of a bond that refused to die, was the Alpha King, waiting, not commanding, not demanding, not breaking down the door, just waiting. And that, more than any grand gesture or public declaration, was the thing that frightened Isolde most of all. The Whisperwood swallowed them whole. On the first morning, the trees closed behind Isolde's party like a curtain drawn across a stage, and the world they knew ceased to exist. There was no sky, only a low, suffocating canopy of ancient pines whose branches wove together so tightly that the pale winter sun was reduced to a diffused, ghostly glow that barely reached the forest floor. The snow here was not the clean, windswept white of the open plains. It was deep, heavy, layered with decades of fallen needles and frozen debris that made every step a negotiation between boot and earth. 12 rangers moved behind their queen in a single file line, each wolf handpicked by Darius for endurance, silence, and the particular kind of stubbornness that kept a body moving long after the mind had begged it to stop. They were lean, hard wolves, most of them born in the outer territories where survival was not a given but a daily argument with the land. They carried light packs, short swords, and the grim, focused expressions of soldiers who understood that the margin between success and death in the Whisperwood was measured in degrees of temperature and minutes of daylight. Isolde led from the front, She had not asked to be placed there. She had simply started walking when the first gray light of dawn cracked the horizon, and no one had stepped in front of her. It was not deference born of her title. It was something else, something that had settled over the group in the final hours before departure, when they had watched their queen check every pack, test every blade, and memorize every mile of the route on the map with the quiet intensity of a woman who intended to bring every single one of them home alive. They trusted her, not because she was a queen, because she had earned it. The cold was a living thing. It crawled beneath their furs and woolen layers, found the gaps between collar and neck, sleeve and glove, and drove its fingers into flesh with a patience that was almost sentient. By midday of the first day, the temperature had dropped so far that the moisture in their breath froze on contact with the air, creating small clouds of ice crystals that hung in the stillness before dissolving. The trees groaned around them, their ancient trunks contracting in the cold, with sounds like the bones of giants shifting in their sleep. Isolde did not slow. She set a pace that was demanding but sustainable, reading the terrain with an instinct that surprised even the most experienced rangers. She chose paths where the snow was shallowest, where fallen trees provided natural bridges over frozen ravines, where the wind had carved corridors through the dense undergrowth. She rationed their rest breaks with precision, long enough for muscles to recover, short enough that the cold could not settle into their bones. On the second day, they lost the trail. A storm had come. In the night, sudden and vicious, dumping 2 feet of fresh snow that erased every landmark and turned the forest into a featureless white maze. The lead ranger, a grizzled wolf named Corwin, who had spent 20 years patrolling the northern border, came to Isolde with worry carved deep into the lines of his weathered face. "My queen, the trail markers are buried. I cannot find the ridgeline we need to follow. If we veer too far east, we hit the frozen marshes. Too far west, the ravines. Either one could cost us hours we do not have." Isolde stood at the front of the line, her dark hair dusted with snow, her cheeks raw from the wind. She closed her eyes. She breathed in through her nose, pulling the frozen air deep into her lungs, and she let her wolf rise. Not fully, not the violent, explosive shift that combat demanded, just a slow, careful surfacing, like a creature rising from the bottom of a deep lake. Her senses sharpened. The world became more vivid, more detailed, more alive. She could smell the resin bleeding from the pine trunks, the faint metallic tang of the frozen stream half a mile to the north, the musky, earthy scent of a bear hibernating somewhere deep beneath the snow. And beneath all of it, faint but undeniable, the scent of wood smoke. Old wood smoke, carried on a current of air that flowed from the northeast. The direction of the quarry pass. She opened her eyes. "Northeast," she said. "Follow me." Corwin stared at her for a moment, then nodded. He fell in behind her without another word. She led them through the storm's aftermath with a certainty that bordered on preternatural, her wolf guiding her through the white silence like a compass needle finding north. The rangers followed, their earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet, fierce loyalty that grew with every mile. They had come into the Whisperwood following a queen. They were emerging as wolves who would follow this woman into the mouth of hell itself and trust her to lead them out the other side. That night, the second night, they made camp in a shallow cave carved into the base of a granite cliff. The rangers built a fire small enough to avoid detection, but large enough to keep the cold from killing them in their sleep. They ate dried meat and hard bread, and drank water melted from snow, and they spoke in low voices about the battle ahead, about the families they had left behind, about the things they would do when the war was over. Isolde sat apart from them, near the mouth of the cave where the firelight barely reached. She had first watch, though 2 rangers had volunteered to take it for her. She had declined. A queen did not ask her wolves to do what she would not do herself. The cave was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fire and the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleeping wolves. Outside, the whisperwood was a cathedral of silence, the snow absorbing every sound, the trees standing like pillars, holding up a roof of stars. Isolde reached into the inner pocket of her coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it with careful fingers, and the firelight caught the soft, butter-colored calfskin of 2 tiny shoes. The embroidery along the soles, tiny wolves chasing each other in an endless circle, was so fine it was barely visible in the dim light. She held them in her palm, these impossibly small shoes, and she allowed herself to feel the weight of them. Not just the physical weight, which was nothing, a breath of leather and thread, but the other weight. The weight of the life they represented. The child who had never come. The nursery that had remained empty. The quiet, private grief that she and Ravek had carried between them for 3 years. A wound that had never healed because neither of them had known how to speak of it. Barren. Theron had used that word like a blade, and it had found the one gap in her armor. Not because she believed it defined her, but because she feared in the deepest, most secret chamber of her heart that Ravek believed it did. That all his talk of fire and passion and the woman he had chosen was really just a cover for a simpler, crueler disappointment. He had chosen a mate who could not give him an heir, and no amount of fire could compensate for an empty cradle. She pressed the shoes against her chest, and for the first time in months, she let the tears come. They were silent tears, the kind that fall without permission and leave no sound behind. They tracked down her cold, wind-burned cheeks and disappeared into the collar of her coat. She did not sob. She did not shake. She simply sat in the mouth of a cave in the middle of a frozen forest and let herself grieve for the woman she had been before the world had taught her that softness was a luxury she could not afford. She wept not for Ravek, not for the bond he had broken or the trust he had burned. She wept for herself, for the girl from the Grey Mist Pack who had walked into Heartwood Citadel 3 years ago with nothing but courage and a desperate, foolish belief that love was enough. That girl was gone. The woman who remained was stronger, sharper, more capable than that girl had ever dreamed of becoming. But she was also lonelier. And the loneliness on a night like this, in a place like this, was a cold that no fire could touch. 50 miles to the south, in a command tent pitched on the frozen road before the quarry pass, Ravek woke from a dead sleep with his mate's grief pouring through the bond like ice water through a cracked dam. He sat up in the dark, his chest heaving, his hands clutching the rough wool of his bedroll. The sensation was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sorrow so deep and so raw that for a moment he could not tell where her pain ended and his began. The bond, which had been a thin, barely audible hum for weeks, was suddenly alive, vibrating with an emotion so intense it made his teeth ache. He could feel her. Not just the sadness, but the texture of it. The old, bone-deep grief of a woman who had lost something precious and had never been allowed to mourn it properly. The quiet, devastating loneliness of a soul that had been forced to choose between vulnerability and survival, and had chosen survival every single time. The exhaustion of holding walls in place, day after day, night after night, while the person who should have been her shelter was the very storm she was sheltering from. And beneath all of it, buried so deep he almost missed it, a thin, golden thread of something else. Something that was not grief or anger or resignation. Hope, battered, bruised, half-starved, but alive. She still hoped. Despite everything he had done, despite every wound he had inflicted, some indestructible fragment of her still believed that things could be different, that he could be different. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He doubled over, pressing his forehead to his knees, and he felt his own eyes burn with tears he had not shed since he was a boy. He had spent months agonizing over the loss of her passion, her fire, her willingness to fight. He had never once stopped to consider what she had lost, what she had sacrificed to become the queen this kingdom needed, while he was busy testing her love like a child poking a bruise to see if it still hurt. She had not lost her fire. She had turned it inward, using it to forge herself into something unbreakable. And the cost of that forging, the loneliness, the grief, the slow excision of every soft and tender thing inside her, was a price she had paid in silence, without complaint, without asking for help, without once letting him see the bill. Darius appeared at the tent flap, drawn by the sound of his king's ragged breathing. He said nothing. He simply stood there, a dark shape against the darker sky, and waited. "She is in pain," Ravek whispered, his voice cracked and hollow. "I can feel it, Darius. For the first time in months, I can feel her, and she is in so much pain." Darius was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Good." Ravik looked up, his eyes red, his expression raw. "Good that you can feel it," Darius clarified, his voice low and steady. "Good that the bond is not dead. Good that she is still in there, behind that wall, feeling things instead of turning to stone. A wolf that still feels pain is a wolf that is still alive. It is the silence you should have feared, Ravek, not the tears." Ravek pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Somewhere to the north, 50 miles of frozen forest away, his mate was crying in a cave, and there was nothing he could do. No army he could send, no command he could issue, no display of power that could reach her. All he could do was what Darius had told him to do weeks ago: wait, and prove, through action, that he was worth the risk of opening that wall again. He lay back down in the dark, and he did something he had not done since the night his mother died. He opened the bond from his side completely, pulling down every barrier, every shield, every scrap of pride and pretense, and he let his own grief pour through the connection. Not dominance, not anger. Not the possessive, demanding need that had poisoned everything between them. Just grief. Raw, honest, unglamorous grief for what he had destroyed and what he prayed could still be rebuilt. He did not know if she felt it. The bond was still so thin, so fragile, that the signal might have dissipated before it reached her. But he sent it anyway, a message in a bottle cast onto a frozen sea. "I am sorry. I am here. I am not going anywhere." The third morning broke clear and cold, and Isolde's party emerged from the Whisperwood, like ghosts materializing from the mist. They stood on a ridge overlooking the rear of Theron's encampment. Below them, spread across the mouth of the quarry pass, in a ragged line of tents and campfires and hastily built wooden barricades, the Ashval forces were dug in and facing south. Every eye, every weapon, every defensive position was oriented toward the main road, toward the direction from which they expected the king's army to come thundering with banners flying and war horns blaring. No one was looking north. Isolde crouched behind a fallen pine, studying the camp through narrowed eyes. She counted tents, estimated troop numbers, identified the command position where Theron's banner, a snarling wolf over crossed axes, hung limp in the windless air. She noted the supply wagons parked carelessly behind the main line. The horses picketed in a flat clearing with minimal guard, the gaps in the barricade where the terrain had been deemed too steep for an attack. They were wrong about the terrain. Isolde's rangers had just spent 3 days proving that. She turned to Corwin, who was crouched beside her with his hand on the hilt of his short sword. "We wait for the signal," she whispered. "When the king's vanguard engages the front line, we move. Hit the supply wagons first. Set them burning. Then the horse line. Then we come in behind their infantry. They will not know which direction to face." Corwin nodded, a thin, savage smile pulling at the corner of his scarred mouth. "They will break," he said. It was not a question. "They will break," Isolde confirmed, and then she felt it. A vibration through the bond. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Ravek. He was close. Miles away still, but closing fast, the thundering hooves of his vanguard sending tremors through the frozen earth that she could feel in the soles of her boots. He was coming. The hammer was falling. Now it was time for the anvil. The battle for the quarry pass lasted less than an hour, but it was an hour that would be remembered in the songs of Heartwood for generations. Ravek's vanguard hit the front of Theron's blockade like a battering ram, a wall of mounted warriors in full armor crashing against the wooden barricades with a sound like the earth splitting open. The Ashval wolves surged to meet them, their war chiefs howling orders, their archers loosing volley after volley from the elevated positions they had spent days preparing. It was exactly what Theron had planned for. His defenses held. His troops fought with the desperate ferocity of wolves defending their own territory. For 20 minutes, the battle at the mouth of the pass was a grinding, bloody stalemate. And Theron stood behind his lines with a cold, satisfied smile on his scarred face, watching the King of Heartwood throw his best warriors against a wall that would not yield. He never heard the fire. It started in the supply wagons, a sudden, roaring eruption of flame that turned 3 wagons of grain and dried meat and winter provisions into towering columns of orange and black smoke. The horses panicked, tearing free of their picket lines and stampeding through the camp in a frenzy of screaming, wide-eyed terror. Tents collapsed, cook fires scattered. Men who had been resting in the rear, waiting their turn to fight, scrambled to their feet in confusion, reaching for weapons and finding chaos. And then the Rangers came. They descended from the northern ridge like shadows given form, 12 wolves moving in perfect, silent coordination. They did not charge. They did not roar. They hit the rear of Theron's line with the precise, surgical violence of a blade slipped between ribs. Isolde was among them. She carried a short sword in one hand and a knife in the other, and she moved through the burning, smoke-choked chaos of the camp with a focus that was almost serene. She was not a warrior in the traditional sense. She did not have the brute strength of an alpha or the savage speed of a trained killer. But she had something more dangerous. She had a mind that could read a battlefield the way she read a supply ledger, seeing patterns and opportunities where others saw only confusion. She directed her rangers with sharp, clear commands, positioning them to cut off retreat routes and funnel the panicking Ashval wolves into pockets where they could be surrounded and neutralized. She was not fighting the battle. She was conducting it, an orchestra of controlled destruction that tore Theron's carefully prepared defense to shreds from the inside out. The Ashval line broke in minutes. Warriors who had been fighting with disciplined ferocity against the king's vanguard suddenly found fire at their backs, enemies in their supply lines, and their horses gone. Discipline dissolved into panic, and panic dissolved into rout. Wolves threw down their weapons and fled into the forest. Officers tried to rally their troops and were swept aside by the tide of their own retreating men. Theron himself was found by Darius in the ruins of the command tent, trying to burn a stack of correspondence before it could be captured. The big beta simply walked up behind the Ashval Alpha, placed a hand on his shoulder the way a man might restrain a disobedient dog, and said, "That is enough." But it was the correspondence that told the real story. Isolde stood in the command tent after the fighting had ended, the acrid smell of smoke and blood and fear thick in the cold air. She held a leather satchel in her hands, its contents spread across the overturned table. Letters. A dozen of them, written in a flowing hand on expensive parchment, sealed with a sigil she recognized immediately. Serena's handwriting. Serena's seal. The letters detailed everything. Theron's plan to destabilize Heartwood by exploiting the king's known insecurities. Serena's role as the weapon of choice, selected for her beauty and her willingness to play the part of the temptress in exchange for a promise of status in Theron's court. Detailed observations about the king's behavior, his growing paranoia about his mate's composure, his susceptibility to jealousy. Tactical assessments of Heartwood's defenses, troop movements, supply routes, all gathered by Serena during her stay at the Citadel and relayed to Theron through messengers disguised as merchants. Isolde read every word. Her face did not change. Her hands did not tremble. She simply absorbed the full scope of the betrayal with the same quiet, devastating calm that had carried her through the worst night of her life. When she was done, she placed the letters carefully back in the satchel and tied it shut. Ravek appeared at the entrance to the tent. He was covered in blood, most of it not his own, though the bandage at his ribs had come loose and a fresh stain was spreading beneath his armor. His eyes found hers immediately, as they always did, as they always would, pulled by a gravity that no amount of damage could entirely extinguish. He saw the satchel. He saw her expression, and he understood. "How bad?" he asked. "Everything," she said. Serena reported everything to Theron. Your behavior, our defenses, our supply routes. She was his eyes inside our walls, and we invited her in. The word "we" was a mercy. They both knew it should have been you. But Isolde was a queen, and a queen understood that there was a time for truth and a time for grace, and that wisdom lay in knowing the difference. Ravek closed his eyes. For a long moment he stood in the entrance of a captured enemy tent, surrounded by the wreckage of a battle they had won, and he felt the full, crushing weight of what his weakness had cost. Then he opened his eyes and looked at his mate. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Not what should we do? Not what does the crown require? What do you want to do?" He was giving her the power, all of it, because this was her victory, her vindication, and the justice that followed was hers to shape. "Theron is exile," she said, "the barren lands to the north, stripped of title, territory, and name. His pack will be absorbed into Heartwood under a steward of our choosing." Ravek nodded. "And Serena?" "Serena will be brought before the court. The letters will be read aloud. Every word. And then she will be cast out. Not to another pack, not to exile in a territory where she might rebuild. She will be made rogue. Permanently. No pack, no bond, no protection. She will spend the rest of her life as what she truly is, a wolf without a home." The sentence was not cruel. It was not delivered with relish or satisfaction. It was simply the logical consequence of Serena's choices, applied with the same dispassionate precision that Isolde brought to everything she did. And it was devastating. For a wolf, there was no fate worse than being made rogue. It was a living death, a severing from the collective that was as fundamental to their nature as breathing. Ravek looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "It will be done." They did not embrace. They did not share a triumphant kiss or a tearful reconciliation on the blood-soaked ground of the quarry pass. They simply stood in that ruined tent, two rulers who had won a war and were beginning to understand the longer, harder war that still lay ahead. But something had changed. The space between them, which had been a wasteland of hurt and silence and carefully maintained distance, was now occupied by something else. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not the easy, instinctive intimacy of what they had once been, but a recognition, a shared understanding that they were capable of things neither of them could accomplish alone. That together, not as mates, not as lovers, but as partners, they were formidable. It was not love. Not yet. Perhaps not ever again, not in the way it had been before. But it was a foundation, and for the first time in a very long time, it was enough. The trial of Serena took place in the great hall of Heartwood Citadel on a morning so bright and cold that the light streaming through the high windows seemed to cut the air like a blade. The entire court was assembled. Elders, advisors, pack leaders from the allied territories, household staff, even the young conscripts who had been training in the yard on the day Theron had insulted their queen. They lined the walls and filled the galleries, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, anger, and the grim satisfaction of wolves who had come to watch justice served. Serena was brought in by 2 guards. She was thinner than she had been the night of the feast, her whiskey-colored eyes darting around the hall with the trapped, calculating look of an animal that knows the cage is closing but cannot stop searching for an exit. She wore a simple gray dress, stripped of the fine silks and jewels she had worn the night she sat in the queen's chair. Her hair, which had been elaborately styled, now hung in limp, unwashed strands around her face. Isolde stood at the front of the hall, not beside Ravek's throne, but at her own carved chair to his right. 2 separate seats of power, 2 separate authorities, united in purpose, distinct in presence. She read the letters aloud, every word, in a voice that did not waver, did not crack, did not betray a single tremor of the personal devastation those words represented. She read Serena's clinical observations about the king's jealousy. She read Theron's instructions to exploit the rift between the royal couple. She read Serena's cheerful reports of her success, her casual assessment that the queen was weak and the king was easily manipulated. The hall was silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. When Isolde finished, she set the last letter down on the table and looked at Serena. The woman who had sat in her chair touched her mate, laughed in her hall, and reported every detail of her humiliation to an enemy who had used it to threaten the lives of every wolf in the kingdom. "Do you deny these are your words?" Isolde asked. Serena's chin lifted. There was defiance there, but it was the brittle, desperate kind that comes not from strength, but from the absence of any other option. "I did what I had to do to survive. Theron promised me a place in his court, protection, status. I had nothing. I was nobody. You do not know what it is like to be nobody." The words hung in the air, and something shifted in Isolde's expression. Not anger, not contempt. A flicker of recognition, brief and quickly buried, of a woman who knew exactly what it was like to be nobody, who had been nobody before a king's mark had given her a name. But recognition was not absolution. "I know precisely what it is like," Isolde said, her voice quiet and clear. "And I know that the measure of a person is not what they are given, but what they choose to do when they have nothing." She paused, letting the silence settle. "You chose to betray a kingdom. You chose to endanger hundreds of lives, including the children and the elderly of this pack, for the promise of personal comfort. You weaponized a private grief between mates and handed it to a man who would have used it to destroy us." She drew a breath, slow and steady. "You will be made rogue, permanently, stripped of all pack bonds, all protections, all rights of sanctuary. No pack in the allied territories will take you in. No wolf will offer you shelter or food or companionship. You will live as what you chose to become. A wolf alone. Serena's face went white. The defiance crumbled, replaced by a naked animal terror that was almost painful to witness. You cannot. Please. I will die out there. Alone. In the winter. I will die. You should have considered that before you conspired to starve our pack through the same winter, Isolde replied. There was no cruelty in her voice. There was only the implacable, terrifying calm of a queen who had weighed a life against the lives of hundreds, made her choice. The guards led Serena out. She did not go quietly. She screamed, she begged, she called Ravek's name, as if the king who had once entertained her at his table might intervene. He did not. He sat in his throne, his face carved from stone, his eyes fixed on a point above the doors. And he let his queen's judgment stand without a single word of interference. The hall doors closed. The screaming faded into the corridors, then into the courtyard, then into the vast, indifferent silence of the world beyond the gates. Isolde stood motionless for a long moment after the doors closed. The hall was still. The wolves watched their queen with an awe that bordered on reverence. This was not the quiet, accommodating woman who had sat 2 chairs down from her rightful place and eaten her meal in silence. This was the woman who had led 12 wolves through the Whisperwood in winter, who had broken an army from behind, who had dismantled a conspiracy with nothing but letters and a voice that could have cut glass. This was the Queen of Heartwood, and she was done asking permission to occupy her own throne. Ravek stood. The hall turned to him, expecting perhaps a speech, a declaration, a king's pronouncement to cap the proceedings. What they got was something none of them had ever seen before. The victory at the Quarry Pass was not mine, he said. His voice was steady, but there was a rawness beneath it, the sound of a man speaking words that cost him something real. The strategy that saved this kingdom was conceived and executed by your queen. She led the Whisperwood crossing. She planned the flanking assault. She identified the conspiracy that had been festering in our midst while I was too blinded by my own failures to see it. He paused. The hall held its breath. Those failures were mine. The division that Theron exploited was of my making. I allowed a personal weakness to become a strategic vulnerability, and it nearly cost us everything. Our trade routes, our alliances, the lives of our people. He turned to look at Isolde, and his eyes held nothing but the unvarnished truth. I owe this kingdom an apology, and I owe my queen far more than words can repay. The silence that followed was deafening, an alpha king admitting fault before his entire court. It was unprecedented. It was, by every measure of wolf tradition and pack hierarchy, an act of submission, not the physical kind, not bared throats and lowered eyes, but something deeper, an intellectual and emotional surrender that required more courage than any battle charge. Lord Edric rose slowly from his chair, his old bones creaking, his ancient eyes bright. He looked at Ravek. He looked at Isolde. And then he bowed, not to the king, but to the queen. One by one, the elders followed. Then the advisors. Then the guards along the walls. Then the young conscripts in the gallery. The ones who had watched their queen stand tall in the training yard while a foreign lord spat venom at her feet. The hall bowed to Isolde. She stood in the center of that reverence, and she did not smile. She did not weep. She simply received it with the same quiet, unshakable grace that had carried her through every trial, every insult, every lonely night in a dead woman's room. She was the Queen of Heartwood. She had always been the Queen of Heartwood. It had just taken the rest of the world a little longer to see it. The months that followed were a slow, careful reconstruction, not of a marriage, but of a partnership. Spring came to the citadel like a long exhale, the snow retreating, the rivers swelling, the frozen earth softening into dark, fertile soil that smelled of possibility. The scars of the winter war healed on the land faster than they healed between the two wolves who ruled it, but heal they did, in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. Ravik honored the terms of their agreement with a discipline that surprised everyone, including himself. He did not cross the invisible boundary Isolde had drawn. He did not touch her. He did not plead. He did not attempt to manipulate the bond or use his alpha presence to pull her closer. He simply showed up. Every day, every council meeting, every trade negotiation, every dispute resolution. He listened when she spoke. He asked her opinion before rendering judgment. He deferred to her expertise in matters of supply and diplomacy and the complex web of alliances that kept the kingdom fed and defended. He became, slowly and painfully, the partner she had always deserved. Isolde watched this transformation with the wary, analytical eye of a woman who had been burned before and had no intention of walking back into the fire without testing the ground beneath her feet. She noted every change, cataloged every instance of growth, weighed every piece of evidence on the scales of a trust that had been shattered and was not easily rebuilt. But she noticed everything. She noticed that he no longer spoke over her in council, that he had begun introducing new ideas by saying, "The Queen and I have discussed," rather than, "I have decided," that he had quietly commissioned the construction of a new suite of chambers in the West Wing, neither the old royal bedroom nor the dowager's rooms, but something entirely new. A fresh space, untainted by memory. He had not told her about the chambers. He had not presented them as a gift or a gesture or a bargaining chip. He had simply had them built, and he had left the door unlocked, and he had said nothing. She found out from Brielle, who had been asked to stock the rooms with fresh linens and had come to Isolde with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure whether she should say anything. Isolde had gone to look at the chambers alone, on a quiet afternoon when the citadel was drowsy with spring warmth. They were beautiful, simple, clean-lined. A large window faced east, catching the morning sun. The bed was new, the wood still pale and fragrant with the scent of fresh-cut oak. There was a desk for her work, a shelf for her books, and a small fireplace with a mantel carved with the heartwood stag. There was nothing of him in the room, no claim, no mark, no presumption. It was a space built for her, offered without condition. She stood in the doorway for a long time, her hand resting on the frame, and she felt something inside her chest shift. Not break, not crumble, just shift. The way a stone in a wall shifts when the mortar around it has finally, after months of patient weathering, begun to soften. The question came on an evening in late spring, when the light through the great hall windows had turned the color of warm honey, and the air smelled of cut grass and blooming hawthorn. The council had just been dismissed. It had been a good session, productive and efficient, the kind that left both rulers with the quiet satisfaction of work well done. They had finalized the Iron Ridge trade agreement, the new bridge through the foothills that Isolde had proposed and Ravik had championed, a project that would strengthen their alliance and replenish the kingdom's depleted coffers in a single, elegant stroke. The elders had filed out with murmured goodnights, Lord Edric pausing at the door to give Isolde a short, approving nod that carried more weight than 1,000 words of praise. Darius had followed, pulling the heavy doors shut behind him with the practiced discretion of a man who knew when his king needed to be left alone. And then it was just the two of them. This had become their ritual. The hall would empty, the candles would burn low, and they would remain, two figures on opposite sides of a vast stone room, sharing a silence that had evolved over the months from something painful into something almost comfortable. Almost. Ravek stood near the hearth, his back to the fire, his face half in shadow and half in amber light. He had changed in the months since the war. The sharp, predatory restlessness that had once defined his every movement had been replaced by something steadier, something that spoke of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before, carved not by age, but by the sustained effort of becoming someone different from the person he had been. His hands, which had once reached for her with the desperate, grasping need of a man afraid of losing his grip, now rested at his sides, still, open, undemanding. He had honored their agreement for 5 months. 5 months of shared governance in separate chambers. 5 months of sitting on the same council but sleeping in different wings. 5 months of a bond that hummed between them like a low, persistent note, neither growing louder nor fading to silence, held in a state of suspended animation by 2 wolves who did not know what to do with it. He had not once tried to cross the line she had drawn, until tonight. "Isolde," he said, and something in his voice made her look up from the scrolls she was organizing. It was not the voice of a king. It was not the voice of a politician or a strategist or a commander. It was the voice of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he was about to step off, knowing there was no safety net below, choosing to step anyway. "Are you happy?" The question was so simple, so direct, so utterly without pretense that it caught her unprepared. She stood with a scroll half rolled in her hands, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in the way she only allowed when the public day was done, and she realized that she did not have a ready answer. She had answers for everything. Trade disputes, military strategy, diplomatic crises, the complex emotional algebra of managing a court full of ambitious wolves. But this question, 3 words long, aimed not at the queen but at the woman, found a gap in her defenses she had not known existed. She set the scroll down carefully on the table. "I have purpose," she said, and the words came slowly, chosen with the care of someone selecting stones for a foundation. "I have security. I have a voice that is heard and respected. I have the trust of the pack elders and the loyalty of wolves who once doubted whether I deserved to stand in this hall. These are not small things, Ravek." "No," he agreed, his voice gentle in a way that did not ask for anything. "They are not small things. You have earned every one of them, and they are yours regardless of what happens between us." He paused, and she could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes, the fear of pushing too far warring with the need to speak the truth. "But they are not happiness." She said nothing, because he was right, and they both knew it. He took a single step toward her. 1 step. Then he stopped, honoring the invisible boundary the way he had honored it every day for 5 months. "I have followed your terms," he said. "I will continue to follow them for as long as you command. If this is all I am ever allowed to have of you, your mind, your counsel, your presence on the other side of this hall, I will accept it. It is more than I deserve." He drew a breath, and she could hear the effort it cost him, the physical act of making himself vulnerable when every instinct of his alpha nature screamed at him to project strength. "But I must ask, not as a king, not as an alpha, as the man who broke something precious and has spent every day since trying to understand the weight of what he lost." His eyes found hers, and they were unguarded in a way she had never seen before. Not desperate, not pleading, simply open. A door left unlocked, with a choice to enter placed entirely in her hands. "Is there any hope for something new? Not what we were. You were right. That is gone forever. I am not asking to go back. I am asking if we might go forward, together, to build something on this new ground that neither of us has walked before. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside the high windows, the last light of the spring evening was fading from honey to amber to the deep, luminous blue of twilight. Somewhere in the courtyard below, a wolf laughed, and the sound floated up through the stone walls like a memory of simpler times. Isolde looked at this man, not the king who had sat on a carved throne and permitted another woman to touch him while his mate watched from 2 seats away. Not the alpha who had flooded their bond with dominance and demanded she submit. Not the desperate, broken creature who had come to her mother-in-law's room in the small hours of the morning and begged her to stay. She looked at the man who had stood before his entire court and admitted his failures without excuse, who had honored 5 months of a cold, loveless arrangement without a single complaint, who had built a room for her with his own hands, filled it with everything she needed, and never once mentioned it, who had learned through the slow and painful process of dismantling his own pride that love was not a thing you demanded or a territory you conquered. It was a garden you tended, quietly, patiently, without any guarantee that anything would grow. She saw the lines of strain around his eyes, the evidence of countless sleepless nights spent alone in a room that still smelled like her. She saw the quiet, powerful restraint that held his body motionless, every muscle controlled, every impulse leashed, because he had learned that the strongest thing a powerful man could do was stand still and let the woman he loved decide whether to come closer. He had changed, not in the dramatic, sweeping way that stories described, not a sudden transformation born of a single moment of clarity. He had changed the way a river changes a stone, slowly, persistently, through the constant pressure of showing up and doing better, day after day, until the sharp edges had been worn smooth, and what remained was something solid and true. The wall around her heart. She had built it in a single night, in a dead woman's room, with a mortar of grief and the stones of self-preservation. It had saved her. It had kept her standing when the pain would have brought her to her knees. It had given her the fortress she needed to survive the worst betrayal of her life and emerge from it not just intact, but transformed. But the threat it had been built to protect against no longer existed. The man who had wielded his love like a weapon had put the weapon down months ago, and he had not picked it up again. A wall built against a threat that no longer exists is not a fortress. It is a prison. Isolde moved. She crossed the distance between them, her steps slow and deliberate, each one a conscious choice. She stopped in front of him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to smell his scent, winter air and pine smoke, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the raw, clean note of his wolf, the one that had once meant safety and home. She raised her hand, not to his face, not to his chest. She reached for the ceremonial dagger at his belt, the one every Heart King carried, its hilt carved with the image of the Heartwood stag. Her fingers traced the antlers, the proud raised head, the intricate knotwork that wound around the handle in an endless pattern of interconnection. "You once told me you were afraid of losing the woman who fought," she said, her voice low, quiet, meant only for him. "But you never lost her, Ravek. You just taught her what was truly worth fighting for." His breath caught. She could feel it. The sudden stillness of his entire body, the tremor in the bond that ran between them like a wire pulled taut. Her fingers left the dagger. They moved to his hand, which hung at his side, and she did not grab it, did not seize it, did not cling. She simply laid her palm against the back of his hand, her touch light and questioning, a gesture that asked rather than claimed, an invitation. He turned his hand immediately, his fingers lacing through hers. The contact was electric. The bond, which had been a low, persistent hum for 5 months, flared to life between them with a warmth that spread from their joined hands through her entire body. It was not the raging, consuming fire of their early days, the inferno that had burned so hot it had blinded them both to the cracks forming beneath it. And it was not the painful, shocking jolt she had felt in the healer's room, raw and agonizing and too charged with grief to be anything but a wound. This was something else entirely, a gentle, surprising warmth, like the first ray of sunlight breaking over the horizon after the longest night. A quiet sunrise that did not demand attention or announce itself with fanfare. It simply arrived, steady and sure, and it filled the cold spaces with a light that was soft enough to be bearable and strong enough to be real. There were no tears, no dramatic declarations, no desperate embrace. There was only a profound, soul-deep recognition between two people who had walked through fire separately and were now, tentatively, carefully, choosing to stand in the same clearing. She gave his hand a small, firm squeeze. It was an answer, an acceptance, a beginning. He brought her hand to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was not the gesture of a possessor claiming his territory. It was the gesture of a devoted equal offering a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. He did not pull her closer. He did not wrap his arms around her. He did not try to take more than what she had offered. He simply stood with her, holding her hand, and let the moment be what it was. Enough. Far to the north. In the barren lands beyond the last outpost of civilization, a scarred wolf walked alone through a landscape of frozen mud and leafless trees. Theron of Ashval, who had once commanded an army and ruled a territory that stretched from the mountains to the river, now wore rags and ate what he could scavenge from the leavings of wilder, lesser creatures. His name was a curse in every hall from Heartwood to the Eastern Sea. No pack would shelter him. No wolf would meet his eyes. And further still, on a road that led nowhere, a woman with whiskey-colored eyes and hollow cheeks trudged through the last of the spring mud. Serena, who had once sat in a queen's chair and laughed too loudly in a king's hall, was thinner now, her fine bones pressing against skin that had gone gray with exposure and hunger. She was rogue, permanently. No bond hummed in her chest, no pack song echoed in her blood. She was a wolf cut loose from the web of connection that gave their kind meaning, and the silence inside her was the kind that drove wolves mad. She would survive. Wolves were resilient creatures, but she would survive alone, and for a wolf, that was a fate worse than a clean death. Back in Heartwood Citadel, in the gentle light of a spring evening that smelled of hawthorn and new beginnings, a king and a queen stood hand in hand in an empty hall. They were not what they had been. That love, young and fierce and blind, was ash on the wind. But from that ash, in soil that had been tilled by suffering and watered by patience, and warmed by the slow, stubborn work of two imperfect people choosing each day to be better than they were the day before, something new had taken root. It was not yet a tree. It was barely a seedling, fragile and pale and vulnerable to any number of frosts that the future might bring. But it was alive, and it was theirs. Isolde leaned her shoulder against his, a small, voluntary contact that sent a ripple of warmth through the bond. He leaned back just slightly, just enough to let her know he was there. They stood like that for a long time, two silhouettes framed by the last light of the dying day, A king who had learned to kneel, and a queen who had learned to rise, bound not by the fragile fire of passion, but by the quiet, unbreakable strength of a love that had been burned to nothing and had chosen, against all odds, to grow again. The great hall of Heartwood Citadel had seen centuries of triumphs and tragedies, coronations and conspiracies, feasts and funerals. Its stones remembered everything. And tonight, they would remember this. The night an Alpha King held his queen's hand in the fading light and did not let go. And the queen, who had once walked away from him without looking back, chose to stay. Not because she had to, because she was finally, after everything, ready to begin again.